Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President, Chief Historian, and Director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Elyse Miller, our President and CEO, Pam Schaffler, Chair of the Board of Trustees, all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowin, Adam and Diane Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. As many of you know, we launched the Center for Women's History in early 2017. It is the first initiative of its kind in the nation within the walls of a major museum. Now, even during this challenging time of the COVID-19 pandemic, we remain committed to exploring the lives and legacies of women who have shaped and continue to shape the American experience. Which brings me to today's conversation. I'm delighted and honored to introduce tonight's extraordinary panel, Tasty Characters, Gender and Marketing in the Food World. Emily J.H. Contois is Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa and the author of Diners, Dudes, and Diets, How Gender and Power Collide in Food, Media, and Culture. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Brown University and three master's degrees. Her research explores the connections between food, the body, health, and identities in US popular culture and media, and has been published in numerous academic journals. She has also written for NBC News, Jezebel, and Nursing Cleo, and appeared on CBS This Morning, BBC Ideas, and Ugly Delicious on Netflix. Emily Elyse Miller is the founder, CEO of the next generation cereal brand OffLimits, and author of Phaidon's Breakfast, the Cookbook, featuring 380 traditional breakfast recipes from around the world. She is a food writer and culinary consultant based in New York City. She is also the founder of Breakfast Club, a global event series that connects culinary and design innovators and chefs through the ritual of breakfast. Our moderator, Dana Cowin, is an evangelist for good food and good people, coach for creatives, host of podcast Speaking Broadly, and creator of Giving Broadly, a website to highlight products by women entrepreneurs that make our lives more delicious. She is also the former longtime editor-in-chief of Food and Wine. A sought-after speaker, Cowin has been a judge on Bravo's Top Chef, a presenter at TEDx Manhattan, a motivational speaker for brands like Bacardi, lecturer at Food and Wine Classic, and multiple other food festivals and other events. A noted author, Cowin in 2014 published Mastering My Mistakes in the Kitchen, Learning to Cook with 65 Great Chefs and over 100 delicious recipes, which garnered a spot on many best of fall lists. Now, their conversation will last around 30 minutes with time for Q&A at the end, which you, the audience, can enter any questions you have into the Q&A box during the course of the conversation. Without further ado, welcome Emily, and Dana.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's just such a thrill to be here with you, to be here with the New York Historical Society and all of you in Zoom land who we can't see. I have the pleasure of having a double Emily, two Emilys, and I think that we're going to revert to last names here to keep it simple. I was inspired to do this panel today when I put together Giving Broadly, which, as Valerie said, it's a website that highlights 40 brands from 43 extraordinary women. And one of those women was Emily Miller for her cereal brand OffLimits, which Emily eats all day long, never with milk, and not in the morning as one eats breakfast, because she's completely subverted the idea of, who's cereal for, what are the characters, what does it taste like? So when I was thinking about how can I bring this idea of the women who change the conversation to a broader audience, I reached out to the New York Historical Society and I was like, ooh, let's put this idea of gender and food and marketing into a larger historical context. And I'm like, who would be a good person to talk to? And it was the New York Historical Society that very generously introduced me to Emily Contois. And then I dug into Emily's work. And I mean, anything that has diners, dudes, and diets, just the alliteration alone. And then, you know, the notion of gender and marketing, which aligns so closely with Miller's work. I was like, I want to hear what these two women have to say about food, gender, marketing, and the way that you know, gender and marketing have influenced what we eat, how we buy, and how we think. So we're going to discuss the social and cultural significance of gendered everyday foods. Contois is very interested in things like yogurt, and Miller is interested in breakfast. There's a little overlap there. So I'm going to ask a very broad question to start, which is to both of you. How does the history of the food marketing machine influence the scholarship and the product that you create? So, Contois, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Certainly. So even though I'm studying the 21st century, right, the crisis that we're in right now, the way you really understand it is to look back and to understand how our ideas about the consumer culture broadly, about what we consume, how it represents ideas about who we are and who we can be. For men and women, that has held ideas about modernity, about transgression, about affluence, about making it, about the American dream, right? All these really big ideas. And so for me, that history is really profound and important for us to be able to unpack the crises, the questions, the paradoxes that circulate around us in this moment. So history is always a part of our answer.
But in your, I mean, when you're looking at your exact, you know, for the case of the book, for example, for food, and like, can you just talk a little bit about your lens, like in particular in the book that you've just published, just to give people a little bit of a sense of the part of this conversation and why you're like so ideal for this today?
Sure. So I'm looking at how the food media and marketing industries went after men with foods and figures that were perceived to be feminine. So how do you get men to eat yogurt if they think it's only for ladies, or to drink diet soda, or to try Weight Watchers, or to watch Food Network? And so I argue that the way they did that is through a particular kind of masculinity that I called the dude. So this is the slacker hero. Right? He's so uninvested, he's so insincere that he can navigate into all of these food spaces without any sort of risk to his sense of masculinity. Because I think part of what I love about Emily Miller's work is like pushing back against this idea of like, don't put me in a box, right? All these ideas about a binary understanding of gender. The foodscape has done a lot of damage in really assigning very binaristic understandings of what femininity is, what masculinity is. So I looked at how the dude was one particular example of how these industries navigated that. But to understand that, right, you go back 100 years, but that's the gender I'm looking at right now.
I'm so interested why, you know, the dude is particularly interesting because he's kind of a midpoint, right? I mean, he's given up so much in order to allow himself to not feel the crisis and all the emotions, which we'll get to the emotions soon, but I feel like that's important. And Miller, do you want to tell us about, you know, your work in terms of what you were thinking about when you're creating characters and creating OffLimits?
Yeah, the genders actually came second. It happened really organically for me, but it wasn't until halfway through the process where I realized how biased the cereal industry is. Like the history of cereal is men. Like obviously men created cereal, they run all the cereal brands, that in a culture that we exist in today, we understand that.
Did they really invent all the cereal?
Yeah, I mean, who knows who actually invented it, who took who from what, you know, there's like, that part of history is always kind of blurry, but what was really interesting to me was realizing that there were no female cereal mascots. No female cereal mascots from any of the major companies, which is insane for, you know, over 100 years of cereal existing in the way that it does, decades of character development, relatability to the American consumers, zero women, even though women were the ones exclusively purchasing the cereal, mostly at like during that time. So that was the most frustrating part for me. And as I was building these characters, there was a female identifying mascot already. And then it wasn't until I started looking really deep into this history that I realized that Dash was the first ever female cereal mascot in American history, which is insane. And of course, there's licensed characters like Powerpuff Girls cereal, Barbie cereal, like Cocoa Pebbles kind of stuff, but it was never a cereal brand wanting to champion a woman as a female identifying character at all as the main mascot of their brand.
Contois, can you explain that, like historically, because you've studied these things, like why was that? Is it just because men were in charge in making cereal? Like how does that happen? How does an entire gender get left out?
So Emily's totally right that women have been doing most of the grocery shopping in families, right, for a very long time. We're only starting to see that shift a little bit, but it's still food labor that's done by women. But one of the concepts that I look in my book is something that marketing scholars call gender contamination. So the idea that if a brand is perceived as feminine, men are less likely to buy it because of this perception that's going to make them feminine. So for the food product, I found that fear of gender contamination runs quite deep. I start my book with a story about Luna bars, right? When they launch as this, nutrition bar for women, and men writing, asking, will this make me grow breasts? And we're hearing the same sort of, laughable fears about things like the Impossible Burger, and all sorts of, sort of soy substitutes as we look at plant-based meats, that we hear these like joking sounding, but quite serious questions coming from men, particularly sort of conservative bent men, right? Who have this, very sort of constrained idea of like what a man is supposed to be and do and eat. And so for a man to eat something feminine, there's a risk. For a woman to eat something that's, masculine, that's an upward mobility, right? That because we live in a patriarchal society, right? Women can smoke cigars and drink whiskey, and like maybe people think it's odd, but it's not the same thing, right? As the idea of men losing their power.
Wow. That's fascinating that, the notion of gender contamination I thought was so interesting in your work, and it's nothing that I had never come across that notion before. One of the things that, Contois, you talk about in your work is the notion of food expressing anxiety and fear. And I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit, because for Miller's part, she's very, very interested in the notion of emotionally unstable characters, which I feel like I haven't seen. Emily, I feel like you've Miller, I feel like you've groundbroken in so many different ways. But can you tell me, Contois, a little bit about that notion of, fear and anxiety?
Yeah, so a lot of the food studies tradition has gone the opposite way of telling us stories about how food brings us together, how it's this building block of culture, of community. And so I was really fascinated, how is it this space of anxiety, of exclusion, of contradictions? Because part of where I started was studying diet culture. That my way in, my argument was, if you wanted to understand American food culture, you had to understand why we're so anxious about what we eat. So instead of a foodways approach, which is understanding us through what we eat, I'm so interested in who are we by the foods that we try so hard to limit and avoid, the foods that we demonize, the foods that we moralize, the ones that, somehow become good foods or bad foods, and we thus become good or bad people by eating them, right? These really destructive logics that diet culture gave us, that then we see certain parts of the food industry certainly replicate. Right? There's a big, capitalist impetus, right, to that kind of a sales pitch to continue selling products. So I share in your enthusiasm for embracing that instability that Emily's brought in with her project.
Do you want to just talk a little bit about your characters and tell us their names and what they represent and how you arrived at that notion?
Yeah, so the characters really came before the flavors in the cereal, because it was important to me, especially after so many decades of, I guess, like lacking of modern storytelling when it comes to characters in the cereal space. I wanted to be a brand that could represent modern generations, like millennials, Gen Z, even Gen A. Like, who are these mascots that kids look up to, that we associate ourselves with, that are like speaking on our behalf, essentially, as representatives of brands. So Dash is the female identifying mascot. She's this overachieving kind of side hustle for your side hustle bunny in an 80s style kind of power suit and like hype beast sneakers. And she is just like always kind of chasing success and like what that means. And she just feels this immense pressure to succeed, and that gives her a lot of anxiety. So we really try and normalize and destigmatize talking about mental health. And I think in a way, like millennials and Gen Z almost glamorize the mundane things in life and embrace depression and anxiety because it's just such a normal part of our everyday world. And having a creative background, going to art school, really just working with so many creatives over my career, the two characters that we have are honestly the extremes that creative people go through on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, whatever. It just represents these extreme personalities. And that's why we call them unstable characters, because you kind of are trying to learn how to wield your emotions in a way that helps you succeed and do the things that you want to do. So Dash is trying to be successful in that way. And then Zombie is our kind of non-binary, sad boy kind of artist character who like skates and is just like really chill. Like Zombie can relax you, like you feel like really calm and level, but then the downside to their personality is a little bit of like spurts of depression and like not really knowing to do with like being alone sometimes, and really kind of like conquering all of these things that honestly everyone deals with. It's not just kids, but I think it's really important if you're making a cartoon character that is relatable to young people in any way, that you should be doing something with it.
How did cereal and cartoons and mascots get so intertwined in the marketing? Like, is that a historical reference point? And why is that? And do all foods, Contois, have these mascots the way that cereal does? Like, is that?
They don't have mascots, but this idea of a brand, right? Like I teach that to my students, like all the brand does is differentiate between dramatically similar products. And so oftentimes, right, this idea of the mascot or the logo, right, that it's colors and shapes and topography and, you know, characters, but then also the idea of like, how does that speak to you? Right? Whether it's something that you want to be a part of or something that you want to be like. I think there's big conversations now about things like, you know, corporate social responsibility. Does a brand stand for something? Does it stand for the values that you hold dear? And so we often talk about, you know, Gen Z and millennials being the first generations to feel that way. But when you go back in the advertising literature, it's sort of always resonated with youth. So this idea of youthfulness in this space of marketing is really fascinating too. But I saw Emily nodding, like I'd love to hear your thoughts of how you thought about the history of coming up with this sort of the idea of characters in cereal.
Yeah, I feel like, so it's a little bit of like the diet culture, a little bit of like the toxic marketing and ad culture of when all of these cereal brands kind of started coming out. They needed a way to get kids to like cry on the floor and beg to their parents to get this cereal. And the best way to do that is like relating to these kids, bright colors, like fun cartoons and animations and Saturday morning cartoons. It's like the perfect time to be bringing in other kind of characters, and like they can have this character in their home with them if only their mom would buy it for them, kind of thing. So I think that cereal has been really directly marketed to kids in that way. And moving forward into now, there are so many other brands that are marketed to adults that also have this kind of animated and like mascot character driven quality to them as well. But the intentions are sometimes questionable. Like the diet culture marketing is very, very rampant and real.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Contois? Because I know you started, you know, your original work was around the notion of diet, and of course this book is as well.
Yeah, I thought that's what this whole book would be. And then as I started looking, the patterns that you see in just, weight loss, something like Weight Watchers and Nutrisystem, how they market themselves, that I actually saw those ideas in all these other food and food media spaces, right? That those ideas were happening on Food Network. They were happening with different brands in food television. One of the most interesting and frustrating spaces, where it was the page of like, quote unquote, men's cookbooks, of seeing how these ideas about who can cook and what and how, even the way, that professional chefs would be writing head notes or writing forwards to these books for everyday men at home, that we see how deep these stereotypes go, and these conventions that we're trying to overturn. But no, like it's so much of it comes back to the fact that we live in a patriarchal culture, right? That's where the power deposits most easily and readily, and that's what we're pushing against to really change. So that's why I think this conversation is so exciting.
It really affects women so much too. Our tagline is, "We never put you in a box. Boxes are for cereal," very intentionally, because we kind of we don't want to tell you what to do. Like, you deserve to have something sugary, sweet, delicious, amazing. Like, we care about ingredients and quality sourcing and things like that. But then the health side of everything, you can see something marketed that has all these, like, all the buzzy health terms on it possible, and then you look at the ingredient panel and it's like, no, like, this is not what you're telling me it is. And only people who have the privilege of knowing about food and educating themselves about food kind of can decipher that. So we're really trying to say, our brand is really colorful and bright and uses incredible ingredients and is healthy for you, but that's kind of your decision. It's so frustrating. Contois, I'm sure, like, this is, yeah.
Well, even I love the point that you made about Dash, right? About how she's anxious about sort of like achieving her career and, like, meeting all of these goals. And that there's been really interesting work of just like the anxiety of like achieving these ideals that we put up about what in the world gender's supposed to be, right? It's hugely anxious to, do all these things you're supposed to do to supposedly be a woman and a good mom and a nurturing person, right? To make everyone else comfortable before you do yourself, right? That food has been this space in particular where that's expected of women. And yet to always be sort of denying yourself, right, was also this message that diet culture gave you. You have to nurture and feed and look after everyone else, and then always being denying yourself. And so it's been interesting as I studied men, in this 21st century moment, that the demands are different, but they are escalating in really interesting ways for men too, right? We're, well into the second decade of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and, even the guy next door, right? Like when Chris Pratt became a muscle man, like we were all screwed, right? Like that changed the conversation. So, this idea that these unreasonable demands are put on all of us. And so this idea of like not putting any of us in a box, like I love it. Totally. Put it on a sweatshirt, put it on a tote bag, put it on everything, for how it resonates with women. But I think it resonates with everybody, right? Like when I teach queer studies with my students, like that was supposed to be this revolutionary potential of that category, right? That you couldn't identify who you were, right? That was the word that left it all open, right? That got rid of the box. So I love that tagline so much.
And I also think, when Miller's talking about the characters, they're identifying, and there's a question mark, you don't know. I wonder whether, that makes people identify with them more, to understand them better. Have you gotten response from, cereal eaters who are saying, I feel that this represents me? Do you get that kind of, I hate to call it consumer feedback because that sounds so focus groupy, but what have you heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's some good stories and there's some bad stories. I mean, people will start talking to the characters. Like, they'll send us DMs, they'll send us emails, and they'll address it to Dash or Zombie, or like they really get it. And it like warms my heart so much when people do that. And we get such kind notes of just all these like stories. And it's really interesting because I've never thought of the character in ways like this sometimes. And
But wait, what kind of notes? Like,
so this woman emailed us, this was early on when we launched, and she said that Dash was a nickname that she had with her mom, and they would eat cereal, or there was something about like the flavor or the personality of Dash that like reminded her of her mom, and the fact that her name was Dash, she was like, this was made for me, like this was so perfect. And it was just really sweet. And then we're really sassy when we respond with the characters, like through customer service. So I think people just appreciate that and they talk to them like they're people. And on the kind of hate side of things, it's frustrating because on a lot of social media platforms, like we own their gender. Like we say Dash is female identifying, we say that Zombie is non-binary, and people don't like that. Like they don't want cartoons to have a gender. They don't want us to be responsible for that. Like, but it's really, when you look at the people who are commenting on it, it's people who are not really understanding who this character is as a person, as a human in real life, and like how it actually does relate to them and what society is like right now. So putting these characters out in the world and giving them these voices, it's honestly a direct mirror of the way people act right now.
Well, something, Contois, in your work, you've talked about how, what is it, that you see the peak reactions and resistance to gender transformation during times of intense social change. And I wonder if that's a little bit of what Miller's referencing here. And I used a lot of big words, at least for me. Can you just like unpack what that means and, you know, explain to people like what are some other peak times and what did we see at those times and what does that portend for like this moment today?
Yeah, I think it totally makes sense that you're seeing that, Emily Miller, because we're in a moment of big strife, right? We're changing social norms, economic issues, right? Big political change, all of our concerns about a changed climate in crisis, right? This is a big moment where so much is going on. And so it makes sense that we turn inward in some ways to control food, right? Access to good food, right? To cook our food, to feed our families, right? That it can be this productively sense of control, right, that we're seeking. And so you could look at something, you know, like the counterculture in the 1960s of going back to the land, and of going back to, you know, homesteading and really wanting to get outside of sort of the systems that existed, to go more slowly and to eat foods that were brown and didn't come from animals, right? Like this pushing back, that was another moment, right? When we had the Vietnam War, we also had concerns about oil, about climate, about the civil rights movement, right? Like again, so many things coming to a head, colliding all at once. And some of these big concerns about bodies and weight loss and anxieties around that, I mean, multiple scholars point to the late 19th century, where dealing with the collision of the three biggest changes, right, still in a lot of American life, of this shift to industrial capitalism, huge waves of immigration, and then urbanization to move to cities, right? That changed so much about how we ate, how we thought about food, and how we thought about our bodies. So those are just a couple of moments, right? So whenever we have these big historical inflection points, you can look to the anxieties, the questions, the hopes that people had about food in their bodies, and it tells those stories.
So do you think that the food itself, you know, the food that we're turning to now, in fact, reflects the type of food we were turning to, you know, in the late 60s? I mean, I see some similarities. I'm just curious what your thoughts are there.
Yes, I think that's maybe the easiest inflection point to see how similar it is. The idea that if we turn to organic and small and knowing our farmer, right, that so much of it is about getting outside of systems that are unjust, right? When we think about how animals are being produced, if we think about how food access, right, is inequitable, even though we have lots of food, right, that is, you know, problems of distribution, not of creating enough food, right, when we think about things like global hunger. But this idea, right, that we could turn to plants, to organic methods, to growing our own food, right? That there's a lot that relates there. But to give another example, right? If we look at World War I and World War II, right? Of growing our own food to sort of support the home front, of how we thought about the strength of the nation, that it's a lot of really complex ideas that are always woven up in any of these historical moments.
And Miller, do you see anything about this moment in time that seems so like you couldn't have really done this at any other moment in time? Do you think? I mean, like, how do you?
Even, like, we're trying to do it now. It's been hard. Like, it's a good time. Like, I feel like the timing is right, and we're facing a lot of challenges that I think might have crushed us any earlier doing this, but now we're really fighting through it. So We have a strong enough.
What type of challenges are those?
It's being different in a way that we are. Like, as a food brand, as a CPG brand, there is an expected trajectory that you have. Like, you launch your brand, you either have a D2C brand, and then maybe you go to Whole Foods, you go to all these stores, like you do things just as you're supposed to do them, just as every other brand has done them before. But I started this brand being like, why are we doing this? I don't know, to make it harder on myself, but it's more just like, this is what I felt. If I were to create a brand, this is the brand I want to see. I think a lot of brands need to start representing the communities that they claim to be selling to, and they're not really supporting them. So if we are a brand that really champions mental health, especially around like the art world and industry, and we want to have these conversations, we need to be supporting artists. So we just launched our first artist collaborated box, and we give to school art programs with the purchase of every box. And we're coming up with all these programs and doing all of these things. And we have just a really different way of doing things. Even our website is not your typical direct to consumer site. It's not maximized for purchase and add to cart, which some investors and people push back on sometimes, but we're like, no, like this is kind of what the future is. Like, you need to build your community and trust first, because when you're marketing and building products for people who grew up with the internet, they are way smarter than you in those situations. And you can't just like push a product in the same way that you have before. And we're seeing this really unique shift happening right now. Like, a lot of my career was also trend forecasting. So I think a lot about the future too. So I'm already like in the NFT digital art space, like how can people check out with Ethereum and cryptocurrency? And then how can they have a digital cereal bit that like represents the box of cereal that they be one of the first food brands that really sits properly in the culture space. So that way we can create our own rules. Like, our name is OffLimits. If we're not doing things that are defiant, then we're not living up to our name. So
I love it. I didn't know you were considering the NFTs. That seems like you're really
we're on this.
I know you're ahead of the game there. When you look ahead, Contois, like using history as your predictor, for the future, like what do you see that lies ahead, just in terms of branding? Because I think there has been, you mentioned that there's like a little bit of a softening of some of these gender identities and like a little bit of change. Do you think that we'll see more of that? Do you think that we're going to actually, see a retrenching, and in the same way that we have such a division in this country, and as you said in your work, like the masculine and feminine are their oppositions that then flow to so many other oppositions. But how do you see, what's ahead?
I'll talk about my hope instead, right? That I think there's space for moving past, right, this binary idea that like this is for women and this is for men, to just having great products. Right, that then you speak to your consumers, and maybe you speak to men and women differently, but you're not seeing your product, right, is sort of in this box in that kind of a way. I think part of what was hard is I'm only studying 20 years, right, like with the foundation of 100 years behind me, but like my examples are from 20 years. And so you'd think that there might be this like more steady progression, right, towards something like a post-gender world or greater gender equality. And instead, right, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And this idea of backlash and regression is actually really interesting to me, because whenever you have one group in society who had less power move forward and have more of it, whether it's how they're represented in culture, how they're represented in legal systems, right, the voice that they're literally able to have, then there will be a backlash. And so even to look at something like The Dude, it's still very much a part of, sort of a post-second wave moment, as we think about the rights and roles of women. And then to broaden that conversation, right, to talk about transgender folks, to talk about non-binary identities, that's where the conversation has to go. And marketers, right, love to think that they are the most modern of men and women, that they have their finger on the pulse of the culture. So I'd like to see them do much more and do much better when it comes to how we talk about gender and food.
Okay, I like sort of, heading towards the hopeful here, as opposed to the literal, where I think that, one thing that Miller has seen is how static and calcified it is, so that you come with something different. You do have, so a lot of reactions. So we're going to switch to getting some questions from the audience. And so for those of you who are listening, send us questions your way, send me your questions, and I'm happy to share them with the Emilys. I'll start with one. Emily Miller, can you tell us how you came to this point in your career? What was your inspiration, and what do you recommend for breakfast?
Of course, I recommend cereal for breakfast. But I eat cereal all day, so breakfast is an anytime food. Breakfast for dinner, breakfast all the time. I just love breakfast foods in general. And inspiration, I mean, for OffLimits, I feel like it's been a culmination of everything I've done in my career, from writing a breakfast cookbook to hosting breakfast events to doing trend forecasting. I went to school for fashion design. I went to like cartoon camps when I was a kid and like drew, and have always kind of been back and forth between art and food and design. So this brand to me like really represents all of those things. Like I was actually with Dana when the flip of the switch went off, and I was like, okay, I'm doing this cereal brand. I like pitched it to her, and she was like, okay. And I was like, okay, as long as you say yes, I'm going forward. And I just didn't look back from there. So I think my career's been, I mean, really up and down and wild, and I've freelanced and done all of these projects and pieced it together, and I never felt like a true purpose or like direction, like I could funnel all my energy into one thing until I started this. And I was like, oh, all of the random projects that I've like collected over my career have now come to life through this. So that was my biggest, I guess, moment of realization in starting this, is that all the weird stuff I've done actually was worth it for some reason.
Okay, what are the biggest changes you see in food marketing and food itself since the big strife Emily mentioned?
I think one of the spaces I'm most interested in is seeing what's going to happen with plant-based foods, right? There's so much investment in figuring out how to do eggs and burgers and chicken, like doing everything differently, right? Of preparing for a potentially, animalless world, which is sort of strange when we look at history, right? Like I think I take the same approach with sort of nutrition and diet trends, right? It's like, well, did someone eat it 200 years ago? Then, if it doesn't make you feel bad, don't worry about it. That like our history sometimes can quell a lot of that anxiety that, the foods were here. But there's a lot happening, right? In trying to figure out how to replace and substitute those foods instead of really thinking about what does a plant-based way of eating look like? How could we do this differently? How do we alter the grammar of a meal? How do we learn from other cultures? But the way it's playing out in the United States is really fascinating. And I think it's another space that also is playing out these contradictions, these tensions, these anxieties.
Right. I mean, there are cultures who have eaten nothing but vegetables, for millennia, but we seem to need to make substitutions. And I think there is something gendered about that, right? Like that you need a burger. Do we really need an Impossible Burger?
I don't think so, but we invested an awful lot in making sure we can have a bleeding plant burger, and welcome to America, now we do.
No, we've got one. Okay. Another question. Some cereal brands have been around an incredibly long time, i.e. Rice Krispies, came to market in 1928. Thank you, whoever asked that. That's cool to know. Does nostalgia alone explain the enduring appeal, or is it laziness on the part of food manufacturers and marketers? Great question.
That's a really good question. I love Rice Krispies. It's nostalgia is something that you can't beat. Like I think David Chang came out with this incredible article in Wired, like I think it was like 2 years ago, but I always reference it because it has to do with nostalgia and food and just how powerful it is. And when you're in a restaurant, you're trying something new, you can't really understand why you like it, but like the flavor just feels like a little bit familiar to you, it's probably nostalgia. So that's your like immediate connection to something. Like I was at Pujol in Mexico City. I was eating this one dish and I was like, I love this. Like I know I love it because this is an amazing restaurant, but like, why do I really love this sauce? And I was like, this tastes like In-N-Out, like sauce that they put on like animal fries and their burgers and stuff in a way fancier way.
Emily, you have to define that a little bit more, like In-N-Out Burger, which is like a cult burger brand, and just like, you could explain a little bit.
Yeah, it's basically like a Thousand Island dressing that's on this burger, and it's they put it on, like, I get their animal fries, which is literally their fries with this sauce and cheese. And I don't know, it just reminded me of that dish. And like, I grew up in Arizona and we have In-N-Out Burger there. It's like a West Coast thing. And I don't know, it took me back to high school and like being there. And I was like, immediately, I love this restaurant now because it gave me this like flashback of a good memory. So the reason why people are so connected and addicted to these cereals that exist, you know, like Lucky Charms, all the things we kind of grew up with, it's because it gives you some kind of feeling or memory. And we all kind of want to feel something right now. So I think that's a little bit why cereal has had such a big boom over the past year or two. But I mean, then you start looking into it and you're like, oh, these ingredients, like, we know better now. And there is a lack of responsibility on these larger brands, a huge lack of responsibility from a sustainability standpoint, from an ingredient standpoint. And I hope that we can grow big enough to have a platform to at least even challenge these conversations. Like, I would love for the cereal brands to get together to fund the science to make a compostable cereal bag versus a plastic one, because I've looked into it extensively and the science is not there. Like, it makes the shelf life less than a month. It's too expensive. Like, all these sustainable things can be fixed. They're just decisions that all of these multi-billion-dollar corporations decide to intentionally not take. And it has to take a new generation of legacy brands to really challenge their growth in order to like make those changes. So I think the next decade of brands coming out with more responsible intentions is going to be really interesting.
Great. How does the gender-based advertising differ in other countries and cultures?
So in the book, I have a couple of examples from Australia and from the UK, where they sadly have quite similar aspects that we do. We need more really interesting studies, right, to see how this plays out in Asia and South America. There'd be much that we could learn. But one story that I'll tell from elsewhere is that the UK has legislation or rules about ads that they will ban, right, that really reinforce gender stereotypes. Every ad that I analyze in my book would have been banned in the UK. And so thinking about what it means, right, that ads, marketing, serial characters have this power to represent ideas about who we are and who we can be. And that should we, right, take more steps in this country, right, learning from others about what we think is acceptable when people's identities and futures and possibilities are what's at stake.
That's profound. And we have one last, like, I like ending on profound, but we have one more question. How do you think social media platforms like Instagram are impacting gendered foods and the gendering of who cooks in general? Yes. You guys are a great audience. Thank you so much. These are such good questions.
Such good questions. I'm so glad you asked about Instagram, because then I can then selfishly plug that with my friends in Yakish. We edited this really great book called #FoodInstagram, Identity, Influence, and Negotiation, that'll come out next year. Thinking about how Instagram in particular, right, has shaped what and how we eat by the way it encourages us to see and interact with food. That when we look at what changed over the last 10 years about what chefs make, how consumers interact with it, the idea that we, Brilliant Severin, right, said, tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. And we've shifted that, right, to, show me what you post, right? And that's this reflection of who we are. So I think social media is this fascinating space. And so it's definitely one that we're working on.
But do you think that it impacts the gendering of food? Like, because you see the people, right? I mean, there's the girls eating salad, the lonely girls eating salad. A lot of memes that are around like the individuals. And I think the question just for our topic is, where does that take us for gender?
Yeah,
and again, that.
Yes. So I definitely studied things like hashtag dude food, right? And things like meat sweats, right? Like, so definitely even in the language of the hashtag, right? How these kind of regressive, bro-y ideas about masculinity circulate. But some of the authors in our book were really smart in pointing out the gendered nature of influencers, right? And influencer labor, the effort of responding to every comment and like, right? That labor is quite feminized. Even looking at the language by which, men might refer to themselves as content creators or some other term, right? Influencer itself has come to be sort of feminized in a way that leads to different kinds of opportunities. So we think that's especially important when we think about food Instagram in particular.
Interesting. Thank you guys. Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm happy to see you here.
Thank you. Thank you all. I don't think I can ever think about food without thinking about gender ever again. So
my work is done.
All of your work it's done and it's continuing. And we thank you so very much, Emily Contois, Elyse Miller, and of course, Dana Cowin, for being with us today. It was extraordinary to hear you all talking about this, and we look forward to more programs with Dana Cowin on food. Please sign up, however, for our mailing list if you're interested in these programs and others, and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming salons like this one. And finally, we do hope to see you on Central Park West to view Cover Story, Catherine Graham, CEO, which is our next big exhibition opening May 21st in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery. Until then, thank you so much, and good night.